Welcome. This is Sandra Hess, Executive Director of the Calaveras Wine Grape Alliance, and I have the pleasure today to meet up with Dick and Ron Tanner from Tanner Vineyards. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure.
I've really enjoyed my time in the Calaveras Wine Country History series. And, something remarkable when I think about the Tanner Vineyards brand, the Tanner family, is that back in 1870, Calaveras County was the fourth largest wine producing county in California, behind Los Angeles, Sonoma, and El Dorado counties. Your family has had a lot to do with winemaking as we know it today. Can you share with us the history of the Tanner family?
Well, on my mother's side, they were most involved in the wine and liquor industry in Calaveras. And her grandfather was named Angelo Shakaluga, and Angelo made wine and brandy in Vallecito, and his winery is still in the bank right alongside the highway as you make the turn uh, uh, on the outskirts of Vallecito. So he was one of the earliest winemakers recorded to pay um, alcohol tax in Calaveras County, and and he made he made his wine and brandy right there. He also had a big family; he had 6 girls, so he had his hands full. And we have a picture of Angelo in our tasting room, and he's pouring a glass of wine for one of his friends. So we're very proud of his heritage in our family.
So interesting to think about Angelo during the gold rush era, coming over from Italy at the time and what the Calaveras wine region must have looked like.
Yeah, I think everything was pretty elementary. It was pretty early. Most of the vines were hand watered to get started, and then dry farmed. So it was a challenge. A lot of people made wine, I think, in those days. So we had a friend that said when he was a young man, he they would get together at Thanksgiving and Christmas, and they would go visit all the guys that made wine, and they would start with the best first, because by the time they got to the worst, it didn't make any difference anyway. So that was a holiday ritual for them.
So, it's truly a family tradition there at Tanner Vineyards. How wonderful that you two brothers work together. You just came in from the vineyards today. What is that like?
We've been doing that for a long time. I mean, we have other businesses and we're involved together in all our business dealings, or most all of our business dealings. So um,
It just feels natural for us.
Well, I know when it comes to the generations of Tanners, we have obviously yourselves, along with your wives, Nanette and Annie, their children, Kaylee, Kelsey, Scott, Mary, Laura, and then their grandchildren also. And so it's wonderful to see the future generations also getting involved in the winery business.
yeah, it's pretty big for us too. I mean, hopefully we're able to hand it over here shortly, and everybody's pretty much involved in it. So it's a pretty good deal for us.
A lot of fun.
Yeah.
Great. So early on in your winemaking journey there in Calaveras County, who were some of your inspirations?
Well, I think one of them was Stu Mast, and one was Steve Collum, and we had quite a few mentors. Scott Clan was helped us along. We also Stu introduced us to a fellow in Napa by the name of John Baratel, and John was associated with a guy named Anthony Bell, and they mentored us along in the early days. And we also had a viticulturist named Peter Viss that helped us with our vineyard. So it was all we also attended a UC Davis a class for viticulture. So it was all a learning process, and still is. You know, a lot of things you learn not to do, and then you learn a lot of positive things. Hopefully, you learn more positive than negative. But it's been, and we feel very fortunate that we've had so much help coming along in our uh, vineyard and winemaking process.
Thank you. And so I know, according to the history, also by the late 1880s, the vineyard there at Tanner had grown into 38 acres, producing about 60 tons of wine grapes per year. And I understand that today you have about 30 planted acres. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's about right, and we probably produce about a little over 100 tons of grapes, and we use about a third of those.
Mhm.
Try to sell the rest of
I
them.
see. And it's from what I understand, you mentioned Scott Clan. 2004 was your first winemaker. For the first 5 years of really kind of building, as wine grape growers, you sold the majority of your production to Kendall Jackson back in that time.
That's right, and we were fortunate enough to have Steve Collum, a former KJ vineyard manager, move up here, and he helped us a lot with our vineyard, and he helped us get a contract with KJ. Also, gave us a good chance to get started in the wine grape growing business.
Today we grow, I don't know, the variety Cabernet, and we just had some new plantings of uh, of Melbec, Petit Verdot, um,
Merlot,
Oh, great.
Merlot,
Sauv Blanc.
and and Mourvedre. We just replanted some of that stuff, and some of them are new varietals for us. So, and we have Barbera, uh, Petit Petit Syrah, um,
Carignan.
Vermentino, and Viognier are some of the whites.
And we originally just started out with Syrah and Cabernet, and Syrah was really up and coming right at that time, early 2000s, and so all ours consisted uh, of Syrah and Cabernet. Then we slowly evolved, and Scott Clan was working for Twisted Oak, and we started selling them a lot of wine, and he kind of helped us along with what we could what we could change over to different varieties and sell to Twisted. So that was a good relationship that worked well for us.
Mhm. Enjoy hearing about the amount of varietals. The variety is just incredible when we think about the viticulture there in Calaveras County versus other parts of the California wine regions. So, what do you think is so unique to Calaveras wine country?
Well, I think we have a great climate for one thing. We get cool evenings, and we get warm days. We have our particular vineyard is very rocky. It's very porous and mostly shallow soil. So by nature we don't produce big crops. And if we do, we thin them down. So we focus on quality, on making the best grapes that we can, because we can't produce a lot. So we don't try to overcrop our vines, and so quality is really what we've been aiming for. And I think that's a kind of uh, very very similar to the rest of the county. I think people here really are focusing on quality wine. You know that it's not because we can't make very much money off of the grapes. We don't produce enough. So I think the focus has been on producing good grapes and good wine.
I hear that. And, we had such a wonderful time celebrating you and the Tanner team at the Wine Enthusiasts event that we held out at Prospect 772 this past February, tasting all of those 90 point plus wines, and just really impressed to see the quality that is coming out of the Calaveras County region. And so, as we move along in today's interview about the history of Calaveras wine, what was it like growing up in Calaveras County as children? I heard that you went to school at one of the one-room schoolhouses and also raised rabbits for the local grocery store. What a fun time that must have been. Is the rural agricultural lifestyle still here in Calaveras County?
Well, it is to a certain extent, but tourism has really taken over here. And when we were young, you could ride your bicycle down the main street of town, and you wouldn't be interrupted by a car. So things have changed a lot in that regard. But I think people are still focused on agriculture up here. You know, it's not a huge productive area, but everybody is focusing on growing their vegetables and animals and so forth. When we were young, um, our grandmother and grandfather raised almost everything they ate. They raised apples, walnuts, peaches, pears, anything that would survive the frost, and then a huge garden, and they had all sorts of farm animals. So we had everything that that we wanted uh, as far as agricultural products when we were young. And a few friends. When I went to school, there were about 6 or 7 kids in my class, and it was just that way. It was just a small community and a lot of fun. You knew everybody then. Now you're lucky if you know 10, 12 people around town. But it was a great place to grow up.
Your children and your grandchildren now, do they still carry on some of the traditions of growing their own produce?
Sure. Now, I think we were just talking about that. Both of Ron's daughters have great gardens, and actually, my both of my daughters have great gardens also, as do I. So
Growing chickens and we
ducks and
ducks, and yeah, we have some goats,
Yeah.
and yeah, I mean they're involved in all of that stuff. So,
Thanks.
so are the grandkids.
The
Grandkids
grandkids
are
as well.
yeah, they just love that stuff.
Thanksgiving at your house must just be a ball. And what a
it's a lot of
feast. What about also the tradition of canning? I think about my grandma, and you reminded me a lot of her. I mean, she always had a passion for gardening and canning whatever she could. Is that something that you're still seeing happen within, your family?
a little bit to a much lesser extent, but we still can a little bit. And we raise peppers and can those, and my wife cans tomatoes, all the extra tomatoes that we have. So yeah, there's still
Jellies and jams, and
yeah.
yeah, all that stuff.
Wonderful.
Not like our grand folks did. Our grand folks used to can everything. I mean, they had a big storehouse, and they had shelves full of canned goods. So it's not the same as that, but their chickens. When we were kids, we'd probably butcher 50 or 60 chickens, and everybody had a freezer full of chickens. Uh, they had milk cows, and they had all that stuff. Not so much today.
Well, do you have some stories that you'd like to share about the history of the wine region? I love that you brought up, Stu from Bryce Station and Scott Clan from Newsom Harlow, Stephen Collum, and all he does is a vineyard consultant for so many. And, this community spirit of families working in the vineyards, working in the tasting rooms. It's a really wonderful thing to see how much people support one another. So I'd love to hear some stories, maybe memories you have about those who've come alongside you and helped out with this.
Well, I can mention one time we were at the wine grape symposium, and one of the classes or seminars was focused on social media, and Jeff Stye gave a talk about social media, and then we heard this young man that was just a dynamic speaker, and he had some really bright, new, fresh ideas about social media. So my wife is somewhat forward, so she went up and talked to him after his speech. But he was the founder and editor of a young people's magazine called Mutineer magazine, and it was really a really a different sort of. It wasn't just wine and spirits; it was also anything that young people drank, energy drinks, and so forth. And it had some really interesting articles. And she invited these boys to come up here, and they decided to come up here and stay for a while. So Murphy's got a real big plug for a year or two through Mutineer magazine. And one of the things that was really special about that relationship that we found, that all of us found, was it's not just about Tanner, or it's not just about somebody else. It's all for one and one for all. It's what really makes Murphy's kind of special. Everybody is working together, and Murphy's is kind of dynamic in that particular area. It's really fun to see, and it was fun to see that kind of grow and blossom. It just made Murphy's very unique, I think.
So outside of grape growing and winemaking and running your winery, what could we catch you both doing? What are some of the things you like to do most? I heard that Barden Steveno was an avid fisherman in Calaveras County.
Say that again.
I heard that Barden Steveno was an avid fisherman in his time in Calaveras County. So what are some of your hobbies outside of grape growing?
Work.
He used to be an avid fisherman, and I can remember one time my grandfather was telling him about a specific big fly that flies around a light at night. And he said it's called a salmon fly. If you can ever catch one of those, then you put it on your hook and take it down to the creek. We lived right next to the creek, and so he did. He caught one, and that next morning he went down to the creek and he caught an 18-inch German brown right out of the creek in our backyard. So that was pretty exciting. So he used to be an avid fisherman.
That's a great tip for those of you in the audience who love to fish. Thank you for that, Dick. Also is an interesting piece that I read in some of the history of Calaveras Wine County, that the Tanners also, Dick and Ron here, were responsible for developing a trellis system that would take advantage of the site's 1,900-foot elevation on warm days and cold nights, along with the delta breezes. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, as we mentioned, there was a fellow named John Baratelle in Napa, actually right in Rutherford, and he raised grapes for Boya Vineyards, and he raised all of his grapes were Cabernet, and he had a specific trellis. First of all, I have to say that in going through the UC Davis course, one of the things that you find, we found out, was the sunlight has a distinct positive influence on wine grapes. So not necessarily direct sunlight, but indirect sunlight. And so we also read Richard Smart's book about, it's called Sunlight into Wine, I believe, something like that. So John Baratelle had a quad system with a cross arm and a V, and he would divide the canopy of this his vineyard, or of this particular row of grapes. Well, we just moved all that up and put a little bit longer cross arm above the fruiting arm, and then the V above that. So it's quite involved, and it takes a lot of hand labor to manage. So it's not just one that you let everything grow and and don't mess with much. It's quite involved, but it really works nice to let filtered sunlight down into the great growing zone, and it's up off the ground enough that it gives reflective light, and we take advantage of the our orientation is east and west, so usually the breeze blows from east to west here. We take advantage of that also in the evening. So it's a long learning process, and we're still learning, but it's a lot of fun. It's been a great experience.
Well, it says a lot about the thought and care you put into every aspect of what you're doing, from the vineyard side of things all the way through to the finished product. And, I look at your fan base, and I look at so many people who visit the Calaveras County region. I often hear them bring up Tanner Vineyards as one of the top spaces they always have to stop by and see. They have to see their friends at Tanner Vineyards. So I think that we're very lucky to have the Tanner family and your team still very involved in the tasting room and the operations there in Murphy's. And so, as we begin to wrap up our time together today, what would you like to share about your wishes, maybe your vision for the future of the Calaveras wine region?
Well, one thing I'd like to say before we go any further is that we have one of the reasons that people like to come here is we have such a great staff. We have nice wine, but you can have all the nice wine you want. You have to have people and good people to sell it, and we do. So we're very proud of our tasting room and tasting room staff. So anyway, that'll kind of give you my overview, and I think Ron can.
I follow right along with his.
So we really appreciate your little visit here, and I think this region has a lot of potential. It's kind of like it's just starting to blossom. It's got a lot of room to grow, and a lot of people are passionate about wine here. So it's a lot of fun to see it happen, and it's a lot of fun to be a part of it.
Well,
A lot of fun to be talking with someone like you about it.
oh, well, that is quite kind, Dick. And I just appreciate you both, Ron, also taking time out. I know that you are on the go, especially this time of year in the vineyards. So thanks for taking some time to meet with me. As we wrap up here in today's History of Calaveras Wine Region video interview, I also just would like to mentioned that we'll continue with this interview series until the last person is heard. I think there are just so many wonderful, rich stories from Calaveras wine country, and we can't thank the Tanner family enough. We can't thank, your great great grandfather, and looking at in 1870 how much your family did. Angelo coming from Italy and carrying this spirit of community and passion for all things winemaking forward. So again, thank you very much for your time today.
Well, thank you too, Sandra.
Thank you.